I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
So I'm going to recapitulate some of the previous conversation, if that's okay. I was reading in a book, Love Relations, about transference and countertransference in psychotherapy, particularly erotic transference and countertransference, which we could imagine as sexual projections onto the therapist from the client and vice versa onto the client from the therapist. And it occurred to me that in any group, including a group of two people, the resistance to collapsing the relational manifold toward sexual eros can, and often does, preserve a variety of options for deeper intimacy and knowing and presence with one another than might collapse into sexual eros if not preserved. And this is particularly true in a group. An uncoupled person, particularly if they tend to have many attractive features to possible erotic partners, presents a much vaster possibility space for intimacy and relation in many ways than a person who is known to be seeking coupling, one who is already coupled, or one who has developed fascination with a particular member or series of members in the group. And I found this very astonishing. I've been aware of this in some conscious ways over time. It occurred to me a long time ago that there are there's a broad garden of modes of eros that are incredibly profound and may even have their own forms of orgasm, which are not necessarily the result of rubbing flowers together or even of having genital orgasms. And this is a very provocative and largely unvisited topic in modernity. And this led to a variety of other insights that perhaps I will get to. And then we were talking also about how transgenderist and non-identification with gender could be exemplars of this goal or motivation, preserving the entire possibility space rather than collapsing it to some, for example, stereotypical mode. And then you brought up thoughts about situations in which, for example, males were castrated or castrated themselves. And so we were just kind of exploring this topic in a way that I think is quite profound. So recently, someone I know was reached out to by what I consider to be a fairly nefarious group. This would be the group of people in the military industrial intelligence complex who are interested in replicating the technologies associated with UFOs. And also various other quantum-based technologies. And I think this is extremely dangerous. What occurred to me in regards to that was that opportunism, in the sense of, for example, me, myself, I would love to have new opportunities for collaboration with intelligent others. Notoriety could also be very attractive. Connecting with famous people, powerful people, wealthy people. And these could produce a situation in which something extremely bad and unexpected happens. I could open the door for the bad people into the sanctum where they're just gonna, run rampant. And this is part of why I I've consciously avoided talking a lot about Toymaker, because it seems that that topic is both very dangerous and sacred in a sense, and not for public consumption. But yeah, I was marveling at the noticing. It never really occurred to me before that the possibility space for intimacy, when it becomes focused towards sexual eros, it collapses in a way that reminds me of the strange collapse of consciousness that occurs at the end of dreaming. Because in dreaming, the manifold of relational branches is both fluid and maintained. And once it starts collapsing toward, quote, one thing, unquote, I'm laughing because of the metaphoric analogy to the penis, and how when guys get a hard on, they're really, we even have this metaphor, right? He's got a hard on for X. Yeah, I mean, it's the possibility space of their intelligence and relational diversity very quickly becomes limited. So yeah, these are just some of the thoughts I've been having. There are more, but I'm very surprised that I haven't been more clear about this previously. And it was very helpful for me to read the extremely vocation-specific language of a psychotherapist exploring transference and countertransference in specific instances of client relations, because it was that seeded my insight mind with this awareness that I have been aware of before. It's also perhaps true or common that unfulfilled eros can drive, right? Eros sustained but not consummated can produce branches of intimacy that are very profound and staggering in their depth. The topic is wildly rich and deep. The author of Love Relations talks about both genders, different gender pairings that can happen, repressed homosexuality in male therapists, repressed lesbian sexuality, repressed homosexuality in female therapists, in their clients, and all of these things. And he says in one spot that he effectively implies that the psyche is naturally bisexual, but the conscious mind has all kinds of bulwarks of defense and transference projection and countertransference projection around these issues, because for many of us, we will consciously severely resist the implication that we might be bisexual or, homosexual. This is particularly trenchant in straight males, perhaps not quite as trenchant in straight females, but also similarly. And this is something I have noticed about myself. There is, yeah, I find it very troubling, because consciously, the concept of having a sexual relationship with a man is abhorrent. I recoil from it consciously. Yet I am aware that my psyche is not so divided, right? So yeah, I'd be interested to hear any of your thoughts on these matters, or even a recapitulation of features of the conversation that happened before we started recording.
Yeah, well, I think William S. Burroughs described homosexuality in terms of desiring to be the other person. So, do you agree with that premise? And how do you understand the relationship between transference and love? Is there a connection there?
Whew. So reading this, it becomes very difficult to understand. Apparently, what he is implying here. So the first thing, let me just finish the first sentence. It becomes very difficult to understand what is meant by love, because how can you abstract or derive it from the cloud of transference, countertransference, Oedipal and counter-Oedipal forces in the psyche, presuming that, the Oedipal models of sexuality from primarily, I guess, from Freud, are in fact common, reasonable tools, like making all those presumptions, which we can presume also that that's not the beginning and end of the story. We can both admit the Oedipal models and also reserve a space beyond and outside them. But yeah, it becomes very difficult because essentially what the therapist who wrote Love Relations, which is just a book I found on the street one day, a long time ago. And I was reading it randomly. It was just sitting there. I was like, I think I'll pick this up and open up a page, right? But the author seems to imply something like real fulfilling intimacy and love are the result of having surfaced and become aware of the Oedipal features, histories, structure of the psyche and the sexual psyche, having brought these things into consciousness over time, gently, slowly, processed them, kind of dissolved them, or at least dissolved them to the degree that they are no longer primarily psychopathological. In other words, we will not simply be trapped in replaying structures of the Oedipal anatomy of the psyche of an individual, right? So that real, true, fulfilling, natural, healthy, so forth relations involve us being freed from the gravity of the psychical Oedipality that otherwise tends to pervade. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that actual love is healthy, well-rounded, developmentally fulfilling, transformative, healing, playful, creative. It's not bound up in the replication of Oedipal or counter-Oedipal transference, which otherwise tends to pervade. Transference or even just reenactments, right? It's like my mother was distant, aggressive, sexually repressed, right? So I might seek, as a woman, a man with whom I can act out those features of my mom, or I might reenact some features that produce the appearance of my mother's psychical situation in relation to my father, who was cold toward her, but wildly flagrant with women who weren't my mother, right? And this is just a really dumb, simplified example for the sake of illustrating the point. So yeah, we're inclined to play out projections, or those might not even be the right word, reenactments, re-embodiments of relational structures that are familiar to us or which we found troubling in our parents and in other adults with whom we were bonded, and in fact also perhaps in our peers who we witnessed and who were impactful on our psyche and our sexual psyche in some way. So
Right.
it's a fucking minefield, because the chances of an individual escaping the like constellation of gravitic black holes in the psyche around gender and sex and sexuality and roles in romantic or erotic relationships is basically not going to happen, right? There are people who kind of naturally are well adjusted, and so their relationship with these features is not quite so pathological. But without help, without something that resembles analysis or therapy, it doesn't have to happen with an analyst. It could happen with a friend or an elder. In our modernity, it's unlikely to, because very few friends or elders are insightful enough to lead us through that terrain and to resist transference and countertransference. So yeah, it's very complicated. What is love, if not the reenactment of para or neo-Oedipal stuff?
Well, is the point of reenactment to liberate oneself from something? Is it a matter of freedom? Or
I wish it were. No, usually it's quite the opposite. It is to so this goes back to another series of insights I had, where we will tend to enact roles that are familiar to us because, quote, we know how they work, unquote. And because we know how they work, that reduces the necessity of vigilance over negative and positive ambiguity. And that's a crucial feature of human behavior. Anything that reduces vigilance is generally tropic, right? We go toward it. Also, we don't know how being human and improvising works, though we may experiment with that. We don't know how that works. We don't know whether we'll get a reward or what kind, or whether we'll be punished or what kind. And often, we think like, oh, people like rewards. No, people like punishment too. The punishment is a payoff, just like a reward is a payoff, just a different kind of payoff. So you can see the complexity here is thick and deceptive. In an actually healthy relationship, improvisation play, the freedom to not engage in familiar role behavior, that's what's liberating. Right? And essentially in Zen and other spiritual traditions, the whole goal, well, not the whole goal, a crucial aspect of the goal space, which Zen would say there is no goal space, shut up, but still, is the liberation of deceptive mind forms, so that you're actually present in a kind of no ground space, in a groundless space. You have no expectations, you're not seeking rewards or punishments. You're actually, all that energy that's normally invested there is free. So you're floating on nothing, and the nothing is far more rewarding and liberating than any enaction of some specific role will ever possibly become. This is part of why it is said, and the words are deceptive, no self-nature is true self-nature. The true self unencumbers itself. And this is how love could be, and sometimes is, at least in moments. But this is very terrifying to the waking mind, to the quote unquote the ego, the self. It wants to feel like it knows what's going on. And if I do this, this will happen. And if I don't do that, that'll happen. Right? It's got this really trenchant stuckness in vigilance, ambiguity, and prediction. And then also the roles of victim, persecutor, rescuer. Those are very familiar roles. So is the role of judge. So is the role of commenting spectator, which, by the way, is the role of the comedian, as well as the fan, right?
So would it be more accurate to say that reenactment manages certain ego boundaries or characteristics? Is that
It does, but the primary goal seems to be reduction of vigilance. And let's be really clear that for this aspect of the mind or the psyche, and those are sort of different things, even though they go together. Positive ambiguity can be just as threatening as negative ambiguity. Anything that fucks up prediction has to increase vigilance. Though positive ambiguity is less imposing, less formidable, it seems to me. But yeah, the humans are very concerned about this. And one of the truly ironic things is what actors do is they sort of show us the way out in a very ironic way. They take a highly structured role and then improvise into it, right? They quote, bring it to life. But what brings it to life is to inspirit the structured role, right? And this is so ironic because the role is fully structured. It's a fucking script. It's been written. All the features of the role, not all of them, but the whole structure of the role is carefully elucidated. And yet there's enough space for the actor to come in there and, let butterflies free in that cage, which causes the audience to go into awe because they're doing the exact opposite thing in their lives. They're not improvising into their role space. They're mostly reenacting familiar relation. A set of maps mostly unconscious of, but would cling to for dear life.
Well, greetings, everyone.
Hey, see?
I love what you're saying. There's so much good stuff in there. And I don't know, I just figured since there seemed to be a space, maybe I'd describe a couple aspects that just, what you said evoked them in me.
By all means.
Yes, and get your reactions. Because I really
I'm going to react
with...
according to familiar. I'm only going to react according to familiar roles, but go ahead.
Well, that's the prison that our minds are in, no?
Right, I'm playing a role right now.
Yep.
It's a very familiar one, right? It's the insightful, therapeutic rescuer / I'm above all this guy. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to do it in a different order, but just based on what you said there, I love everything you said, but I think about it a little, in different terms, like anyone else.
I hope
right?
so. Great. Yeah. Great.
Not to be a broken record, but to give credit where it's due, I think Vervaeke really puts a fantastic point on this to me. There's there's two, just kind of core dynamics to our consciousness as it reaches out to understand and grasp the world, right? And I really love how you described this in the past as the staff and the rattle.
Oh God,
I think
yes.
this is so beautiful.
Let's see. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, not at all.
Everything you described, of course, is about the staff. So the psyche, or the mind, really, in this case, just given what it does understand, it can understand more clearly, clearly defined roles, rules, boundaries, experiences it's already had, things it's already familiar with, And
the psyche, you say?
Well, you use the word mind, and I think mind might be better.
I'd be more inclined toward that, but I'm also open to seeing the psyche in this light. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's important to understand that, you know, there's two dynamics, right? There's grasping what you're aware of. You know, there's the manipulation, the grasping, the approach, the touch, you understand, I'm looking at a table right now. I can see there's a glass on the table. I can reach and grab the glass, right?
Yeah,
But
pragmatism, pragmatic utilitarianism.
yeah. And you have to know before you can do it, right? That's the staff. Now,
Mhm.
of course, the other dynamic is this expansion of the possibility space, of what you're aware of. I mean, my eyes scan the field constantly, right? But it's interesting to
Mhm.
me. I don't really notice anything unless it's kind of accidental or it kind of approaches my interests or, you know, um, the way that I take in new possibilities is really interesting. And, I think that a really helpful way to understand this is the dynamic between awe and horror, you know?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
By the way,
And
those two things can be like almost the same thing at the same time. But yeah, go ahead.
that's where I'm going. Yeah,
Hmm.
totally. Because I think you called it a positive, I forget the word you use now, but awe is that positive expansion of what's possible. So I kind of wonder, there's the narrow kind of egoic mind, the way it explores the things, the way it reenacts the patterns and the habits that it's familiar with, right? But I do think that a lot of people reenact those patterns because they understand those patterns to be safe.
Yes.
And they're traumatized by the unsafeness of
Hmm.
beyond those patterns, right?
Yeah, right. And safe equals repetitively familiar
Yep,
in this
totally.
particular version of safe. Yeah.
And I think reenacting those patterns, within that sense of safety is something that people do quite a bit, right? But I also think that when people sense that there's kind of a problem, a misalignment, a maladaptation of some sort, they want to reenact those patterns again and again, kind of looking for the places where maybe they can expand into newness, where they can realign it in a way that feels safe, you know, where they
Mm.
still feel held and understand it, but can kind of expand into maybe adjacent or close at hand kind of new
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
horrors. So
Right. I
that's that
like
kind of
that.
positive development.
Hmm. Yeah.
But then
I'm not
of
going to go from here to the horizon, but I'll take a few steps toward it.
yep. I'm gonna do this thing I'm familiar with, but kind of wiggle or vary it just a
Hmm.
little bit and see if
Yeah.
that's still safe.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand is horror.
Also, disgust.
Well,
Disgust is very prevalent
yeah.
in human.
Well, okay, let me describe it this way. There's the egoic mind and the patterns that it feels familiar with, right?
Hmm.
And disgust kind of falls within that familiar pattern.
Sure.
Disgust is something like, okay, you're aware of things you are disgusted by, then you encounter it, then you have that kind of standard reaction.
Hmm.
Now, above that would be places where you feel anchored, where you still feel like yourself, where you can kind of explore into the space and expand the positive possibilities, right?
Hmm.
Now, horror is beneath all this. And, sorry to draw it in this arrangement, but horror is a kind of expansion of possibilities within which you lose your mooring to reality, your sense of self. So, for example, people reenact their amorous relationships constantly, and they do it in ways that they feel safe. They may want to like reenact their eros and add a little variation and see if that's
Hmm.
still safe too and grow in that direction, right?
Yeah.
Or one day they may kiss somebody of the same gender and suddenly they're disoriented. Like who they thought they were becomes challenged. And their sense of self falls into this expanse where it no longer has any foothold, any kind of like I'm not who I thought I was, or I'm worried I'm not who I thought I was, or I don't even know who I am. I don't even know what this world is anymore. That's horror. When your expansion of the possibilities allows the ground of who you were to just kind of fall out, and you don't understand yourself or the world anymore. you know And that's deeply challenging to that egoic mind, the self, the thing that seeks safety, right? Because there's no safety necessarily. So that sense of horror, I think, is really interesting too. It's the way in which, I think it can provide a really positive expansion, but like it's important to note it threatens the self directly, the sense of self, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
So I just, go
yeah.
ahead, please.
Well, okay, with this in mind, you can see all the levers this society uses to manipulate people, right?
Oh my God, yeah. Let's call it the representational layer of
Yeah.
this society. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally, it drives all these representational models into people's minds and, wields it against them. And certainly it's all based around that trauma, right? Like the safeness of being heterosexual, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas homosexual not only debases you, but like, it recapitulates all those traumas that we had growing up and through media and culture, like on the playground or whatever the case may be. It threatens everything that you believe you are to be. But what's really interesting,
and thus may invoke disgust.
oh yeah, disgust, I think, is a tool that's used to enforce the boundary, right? Like there is the aspect of having a socially
Constructed.
well, no, I'm going the other way. A socially abhorrent, I don't know, like a taboo relationship.
Yeah, but that's socially constructed.
Yep, totally. And one of the tools used to keep people away from taboo relationships is also a taboo sense of cleanliness. Disgust,
yes, this is my point. That's why I brought disgust in.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, it links to hygiene, right? It's linked up
very
with hygiene.
Strong.
Yeah.
Disgust is one of these things that, like, it's a clear lizard brain manipulator, right? Mm-hmm. It's a if somebody's pulling your strings, this is one of the stronger ones.
Yes, it's a fundamental tool in psyops.
Yep.
Right. Get these people to be disgusted by those people or themselves.
Yep. The other is unclean.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. But the thing that kind of is behind all this for me, at least the words that I would use, deep down, I think the desire here is the desire for unity, right? Mm-hmm. It's to be understood, which can only happen if you also understand, and that desire to come together in a sense of unity, in a greater connection with the universe, including all of its manifestations, like, both the males and females and whatever else in between all around you, But of course, it's governed by all these, like, this weird, what you call it, like psychopomp, or like, all these psychological structures that have been, thrown like banana peels and hurdles right into the way of our own growth,
Yeah, this is the inheritance of individuality, the idea of separate persons, because now we have to. Now we are become manipulables because our togetherness is either missing or totally compromised, or ersatz, phony. Yep. And so in that situation, all of the features that would ordinarily arise organically in communal relations become weaponized.
Yep.
Now you have to buy them.
Right. You can buy a same-sex sex worker, of course.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And but, that is, I love what you said. Like, the punishment is often the reward too.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. For masochists and other forms of people with maladaptive reward centers, right?
Yeah.
And I don't mean maladaptive reward centers, but maladaptive senses of reward, but anyway, I was always fascinated by my understanding of the Greeks were that they felt that their brotherly love among the same gender was the strongest and most rewarding of the loves of the world, at least among their fellows.
Oh yeah, I mean, even in my own experience, the two best friends I had in my adult life in my 20s and 30s, my God, the depth of that relationship. It was very different from my loves of women, but holy shit, the intimacy there. That bond, whoa.
Yeah.
Just crazy. I miss it every day of my life. Like to have that bond with another man. Oh God, please. I want some.
Well, what's fascinating is that you start from a closer basis, right? Like so much of what you share in common is the same compared to
Mm-hmm.
relationships of the opposite gender. You're closer to unity already. And I think it's much more accessible for people like us. I'm kind of like you in the sense that, like the idea of making love to a man, I don't know. That's
Yeah,
pretty,
I could get away with
but
kissing a guy a little bit, but when it comes to penises, I'm out.
yeah.
Right?
One time many years ago, after a lot of drinks hanging out with a bunch of friends, this guy grabbed me and kissed me. And it's not something that I go seek. It's not, I have a partner and she's female and whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that was an interesting experience. Like
Mm-hmm.
that alone was mind expanding because in the sense that it's not maybe my preferred thing, at least not at this moment. I didn't ultimately just outright reject it like with every fiber of my being. And the thing
Mm-hmm.
is that it allowed me to kind of see some value or benefit and to understand that, that's not as abhorrent as society would like me to believe. And that's really
Or
interesting.
even your own psyche.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. Never mind
Yeah,
society.
it was a sense that, okay, well, that's not the devil.
Right.
So,
Right. This isn't the end of the world. Yeah.
yeah. But I think that, of course, this system can't allow people to come together. This system has to smash them into pieces, into nuclear families.
Uh-huh.
The
I mean,
system,
it does both. It does both because
yeah.
taboo is also, right? Don't do that. Right? Oh, really? Okay,
Well,
that
it,
must
it
be a really interesting
subsumes
thing. Why?
it's like, when you see people buying Che Guevara t-shirts,
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
system expands into its own hedges.
Oh yeah, and it captures rebellion, it captures revolutionary stuff, it captures taboo stuff, it captures everything. Right?
Yeah.
There's nothing it can't capture and represent and then sell back to you the wrapping paper of.
It's astounding.
There's something though that I want to mention here just as an aside. My recently ex-roommate has been working at Burning Man for more than a decade. And of course, I've never been to Burning Man. And I only have sort of vague understandings of what goes on there. But one thing that goes on not only there, but in the clades outside of Burning Man that are familiar with and have gone to Burning Man is a thing they have an acronym for. And it's, I mean, I don't know the actual acronym. I think it's a 4-letter acronym. But essentially, it's called a makeout bar. And a makeout bar is where you have a menu, right? I mean, this is my limited understanding of it. You have a bartender or 3 or 4 bartenders, and there's a menu, right? And you can buy like a kiss, a smooch, a hug, an embrace, a tender kiss, a sexy kiss, a light makeout session, a heavy makeout session, or there's some things on there that aren't entirely delimited, right? Like you can buy improvisation, you can buy like all these things, right? And so my friend, who's a cisgendered guy, he's often a bartender at these events. In fact, I think there might be one going on today in his clade in Oregon. And, you know, the bartender is the purveyor of your order. So can you imagine what that would be like? That is so anathema to anything I have ever considered or experienced. And it's not sex for sale, right? It's not prostitution. By the way, there's no charge for any of the items on the menu. Burning Man is a cash-free environment, so there's no fee. When you go to the restaurant, they just feed you, right? When you go to the makeout bar, you just get makeouts, right? There's no transaction. And I can't imagine like having makeouts with random guys. And, you know, my friend, like I said, he's a cisgendered guy, but, you know, he makes out with guys somewhat regularly based on this form of play. And it's just mind-blowing to me. I'm like, oh my God, how could that even, wait, what? That exists? Could I do that? You know, it would never occur to me that I might be capable of doing that. But having known that my friend does it, it becomes apparent that I probably could. Especially because it's not going to get down to the dick, right? It's going to stay mostly not about the dick, or, you know, being penetrated, or having to suck it or whatever, right? So that creates a safety space, much like you were talking about, right? Where there's a degree of safe outside of the familiar that we can explore, right? And these people have just decided, well, let's explore the space of physical eros without going all the way there at the bar, because I don't think they do that, right? I don't think they go to like oral sex or penetration or things like that. Petting, probably. So yeah, that just blew my mind right out the back. I was like, well, they do what? You know? And then I was like, wow, they do what? But I just find it interesting. By the way, in the two spaces that you described, when we were talking about psyche and mind, the rod and the rattle, right? The grasping and the encompassing is another way. Like the fingertip, well, sort of the tip of the penis and then the vagina, right? The penetration, the tapping, the rod, and then the encompassing, the rattle. There's a third space. We might just call it the third space. It's the liminal space. It's the space that is neither one or the other, in which both are involved, but neither become like the thing going on.
It's like the flow between them.
Dawn and twilight, and also hypnagogia and hypnopompia.
Yeah, what's really interesting is to me is the you know, we mentioned one of the core desires is this desire for unity, right? And to be understood and understand. But in order to get there, at least how, you know, everybody I've ever known in this world, we're just cauterized, you know, we're amputated.
Yeah, the circumcisions.
And the core thing, you know, like I think that our skills with the rod are pretty strong, right? But our skills
they
with
prevail.
the rattle, you know, an expansion of the possibilities in order to approach unity or anything else, you know, an expansion of who we are, we have to develop that possibility space, you know, to allow and explore and encounter new things that, you know, we couldn't imagine before. And being able to be aware of all of the possibilities while also being able to grasp and wield them, is that kind of formlessness, I think, that you were describing earlier. It relies on the interplay between both, right?
Yeah, this is the no ground position.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I got nothing underneath me and I'm not concerned about it. It's almost like I'm free falling through experience.
You're not attached.
But I'm not concerned about falling. Right? I am unhindered. I'm not tensing up around anything at all. So, and as little bubbles of tension arise, I notice and they dissolve. Nobody wants to be free falling. Nobody I know. They're not like, yeah, I want the experience of having everything just in absolute flux and with me no idea what's going on and just, yeah, no, I don't think. And yet, our soul, which is not afraid of death, the dreaming mind, not afraid of death, dies every night, no problem. I mean, it's a problem, but, not afraid of death, so not tensing up. And as the spirit tenses up in dreaming, we approach waking, right? That's the actual, you can imagine some men who've become extremely sensitive and intelligent about their penises, right? And they have a tradition of avoiding hard-ons at any cost because they know that as that organ becomes engorged, their sensitivity becomes hyper-focused and declines in all other domains, or most of them. Right? Now this is a joke. I'm meaning this as a, as a humorous thing. Though I did say somewhat recently something that I thought was hilarious, and I suspect nearly every dead grandmother sat up in her grave and cheered. I said, a man who is chronically absent from intimacy in relation is never more absent than when he's hard. And I was talking to a woman and she just cracked up. You're not supposed to be able to say that. You're a man. Men aren't. Don't go around, telling the secrets of a woman's heart. But I'm not necessarily denigrating the erection. I'm just noticing that it's often extremely problematical because men become hyper-focused. And women will commonly say during or after sex, like a 3-word phrase or a 4-word phrase, where did you go? Like, why did you disappear from intimacy with me? And the guy's not going to say, well, we were fucking. Right? But that's basically like, but I became a sewing needle. Right? I just turned into a pneumatic hammer. What were you expecting? I'm making jokes again. But.
I feel funny that when I laugh, it's not heard because I'm on mute, but it's pretty good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so the makeout bar, what a trippy idea.
That's one of the beauties of this. I've never been to Burning Man. My partner's been a couple times, but the art, like the way that you can embark on experiences that expand your mind seem like the major draw to me. What's really, just relating back to what you just said, this trick of like funneling into the personal experience or the projection of the mental concept, the way in which like, where did the intimacy go? Like, that's such an interesting black hole that, the humans all around us are, and me to some degree, depending on the time too, are trapped by or stuck in. That it's got a strange gravity. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier, I'm not sure if you were present for it, about 2 triangles that are really important in my recent thought, but also historical. One is the drama triangle, right? The role of rescuer, victim, persecutor. And we can circle around those roles. We don't have to just play one. though I have a predilection for rescuer. I occasionally like to play victim. So, come at me with a knife sometime when we're together. I'm kidding. And then the other triangle of maybe it should actually start with ambiguity. I usually start it with vigilance. But ambiguity, vigilance, and prediction. And what is obvious here to me lately, one of my core insights, which I've said earlier, but I'll repeat it, is that we will almost all, unless we are trained to improvise, we will almost always prefer enacting a familiar role, even if we know it produces a shitty outcome, because it reduces vigilance, it reduces ambiguity, and it makes predictions much more easy to both conceive of and enact the process that produces them. So most of us will play, there's a huge gravity toward familiar roles. The disgruntled housewife who's sexually unfulfilled, whose husband is a mean man that doesn't see her, and she would like to have sex with him, but his approach is shitty and bothers her. And so she'll only have sex with him if he approaches her in way X, which he almost never will, and blah, 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 right? These roles become very familiar, and their familiarity feels safe. We mistake that familiarity for safety due to the reduction in ambiguity or novelty and the reduction in vigilance. Conversely, we don't know how being human works, right? That possibility space is too vast. And this is part of how cultures weaponize our existence, our lives, our personhood. They just provide predictable roles, right? That's all you really need. Give them predictable roles. They don't really care if they're being punished or rewarded. Doesn't matter. And you can give them really tiny rewards, and that's enough if they're not getting the good stuff, right? So this is part of how our humanity is stolen. To be human means to explore the space without concern about the form of the reward, openly, like groundlessly, playfully. And we find that we get very novel forms of reward if we are indeed reward seeking. And I mentioned earlier, punishment is a reward, rejection is a reward. Various kinds of losses function as rewards because they are stimulating, right? They stimulate us. They motivate us. So this is very complex and fascinating to me. Improv is the nature of humans, but we like to improv within relatively familiar frameworks. I'm just going to tell a dumb story here that I think is hilarious. So one of my close friends, I was talking with him the other night. We haven't spoken in quite some time. And he was a sort of a follower of mine for a time, a long time ago. And he's very spectrum-y, very unusually minded person. I don't think he'd object, although he and I have both discussed the problem of labels. And I acknowledge that problem. Nonetheless, we can use them conveniently while apologizing for them if necessary. And love this guy. He's so brilliant in his developmental tenacity. Because he's tried various things a few times and they catastrophically fail, and then he'll just try them again. Right? Until they work, which is uncommon in many people. A lot of times if we get stung once on a developmental path, we shy away from it in the future. But he was quite surprisingly talking about having had conversations with trees. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's really gone somewhere. I'm like, even I adore trees. I relate with them ceremonially, but I don't really have conversations with them. And the tree, in one thing he shared, the tree told him, in social relationships, you'll find your place much more easily, and boundaries will be sustained and nurtured much more easily if you wrinkle up your bark. Make furrows in your bark. And then things won't be so black and white because there'll be places where you receive and places where you reject and places in the middle, all around you. Now, this is a fundamental intelligent response from nature herself, right? Your brain did this. Your cortexes are wrinkled for this reason. It increases the surface area. So that which comes at you, it's never one thing or the other, right? It's always a multiplicity of things. So extremely intelligent and blatantly tree-like piece of advice. Does this make any sense?
I like it. Makes sense to me.
So I have a tree that I'm very close with, and I once went to that tree with a specific question. I asked the tree for things before, and I give the tree some things too. But in this case, I asked it, I said, I'd really like you to teach me about fairies. I want to know about fairies. Will you teach me about fairies? And the tree didn't say anything. And I would often visit the tree just before making my traditional circuit of, my long walks in Golden Gate Park. And it took me a while before I think I figured out what was going on, because something very strange happened. Over the next week, 2 or 3 times a day, I was getting hit on by gay men. And I didn't realize that my tree had a sense of humor. And I didn't even make the connection. Go ahead.
Yeah, practically literal, huh?
Right. Well, it's like I'm a San Francisco tree, bro. What are you thinking? What do you think I was going to show you? But also, it never occurred to me, and only until I told this story to my friend, it never occurred to me that I might have been dim. I might have been dim. Because one of those men that approached me was so strange in his way of relating with me that in hindsight, I'm pretty sure that wasn't a human being. I'm pretty sure that wasn't a human being. But because I thought he was a human being, and because I wasn't open and paying attention, I treated him as a gay man coming on to me, which of course I don't want. I don't want that. And it even further didn't occur to me that I live in a city. There are no fairies here. In order to teach me about fairies, it might have to find humans with fairy spirits, and those humans might appear like gay men, right? So there's all kinds of features of this thing that are really weird to me and confusing. But in hindsight, I can see that perhaps the tree wasn't merely making a joke, though the joke is very funny, if it was making a joke. Now, I want to hear some George in this conversation. George, what's in your mind? It's time for you to opine.
I'm on my phone right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
I can't really hear Cornfed. But yeah, I think Aleister Crowley used homosexual relations as a tool of enlightenment, basically for dissolving the ego, which is pretty fascinating. But what did you learn about fairies from your experience? I'm curious.
Well, I think I'm learning now more than I did before. By the way, since you're on your phone, why is it that you cannot hear Cornfed?
It's some kind of bug. I'm not sure why.
Oh shit. Okay. Okay. Before I answer your question, go back to what you were talking about burrows earlier as well, please.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of love in terms of transference, as you were saying. But I can see it going both ways, because on the one hand, rejecting Eros can further or deepen certain kinds of, you know, like modes of intimacy. But on the other hand, I think it can also preclude or like function as a means of escaping certain modes of intimacy. So like, you know, for example, in my own experience, I can see how like my reluctance to enter into a romantic relationship is really bound up with like a fear of death, because love is a certain kind of transformative experience. So in like in castrating yourself or in, you know, chopping off your balls, that can function as a mode of liberation, a form of freedom, because you're escaping a certain kind of intimacy, which is otherwise like a prison. So, you know, like women, in my experience, like in my experience with women, I tend to feel like confined, which I think is quite natural. Like I think it's part of the function of, you know, reproduction, to lose your ego in entering into like a relationship with a woman and in having children. Like that's a certain form of death.
Right.
So
Sure.
in
Yeah.
resisting that, I can see how something within me, within my own ego, is resistant to dissolution, which I think is what Aleister Crowley was essentially trying to approach. Because in his system, as you know, as little as I know of it, um, he would deliberately engage in these like homosexual acts in order to challenge his own ego and in order to confront the abyss, which is part of his magical path. But yeah, there's definitely something there. So I can see the connection to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah. There was something though that you said about Burroughs and homosexuality earlier before we were recording. Can you
Oh
reiterate
yeah,
that?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Burroughs basically said that. So Burroughs rejected the concept of love entirely. He didn't think that it even existed. So he rejected like love for the female sex entirely. Um,
Hmm.
he thought that it was some kind of invention, like a medieval contrivance. He specifically thought that it was invented by women, which is kind of funny.
Well, it
Um,
can't be untrue since they invented men. Go ahead.
oh, exactly. See, exactly. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. Yeah, in talking about how like, you know, as a man reproducing with a woman, you know, through pair bonding and just what it means to be human, it definitely undermines the man. That's part of what I think part of what you know, reproduction entails. Like, um, but yeah, the aspect of transference that Burroughs was highlighting is curious, because in desiring to be the other person, there's something like there's something at work there about maybe inhabiting your own universe, or I like closing yourself off. There's a kind of withdrawal from the universe, and like the secondary creation, which is a kind of magical operation, I suppose. I mean, you see the same motif in like the Kabbalah, for example,
In
or in, you
alchemy,
know,
perhaps.
yeah, yeah, this quest to um, edify a kind of secondary or subsidiary creation, which is like cleaving from the primary creation of God. So perhaps Crowley was sort of exploring that dimension. um, but yeah, I can see how in transferring one's own identity upon the person with whom you're engaged in like a sexual act, there's a kind of self work at play. You're basically working on yourself. You're trying to transform yourself in a certain respect, by projecting your own identity upon this other person, in a way that might not be possible in a heterosexual situation. Um, so I guess that's what I was generally considering. But
Yeah, you said something that resembled. You said something very, very crisp. It's not the word I want, but it was very simple. It was like Burroughs envisioned homosexual relations as a kind of mirroring or knowing of oneself, or perhaps even like a transference of onanism onto the other. I mean, I'm making that up. You didn't say that, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. So instead of transferring, it's almost like, in a way, it's a kind of negative transference.
Right. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's
So,
not occluded. It's not occluded by gender in the way that heterosexual relationships might be.
right. And that, I think that broaches what you were saying earlier about your own experiences with men in the past.
Oh, huh. Yeah. There were two of them particularly. One in my 20s and one in my late 20s and 30s. Oh, God, I still love those men. And neither of them want to have any contact with me at all. They're just like, yeah, don't call me. I mean, the second one, we had some text exchanges recently over the recovery of some of our creative endeavors that I had on cassette. And it was relatively friendly, but in no way did he want to speak with me or, discuss like our lives or anything like that. And that wall of no contact, like just don't contact me under any circumstance. I don't care. Don't contact me. That's a pretty painful outcome. And I mean, I'm sure there must be good reasons. I remember the features of situations and my behavior that led to their behavior too, but that led to our breakups. Yeah, those were by far the most deep relationships, and never verged on sexuality for me. I can't speak for them, though both of them were cisgendered guys.
Yeah, but I suppose that I experienced this whole reenactment in terms of a similar kind of transformation. So I don't get the impression that I reenact certain scenarios merely because of some kind of trenchant habit. I really, like in my own experience, I really feel like I'm trying to overcome some kind of grievance or transgression. And that's why I mentioned freedom earlier. I was curious about that. Yeah. So like so some of these fixations that I encounter, I think are really bound up with attempting to rectify some kind of situation in my own psyche, in my own past. And that's what I was hoping to explore. Yeah, it doesn't feel like some kind of inert, entrenched instinct, if that makes any sense.
Sure. And I never meant to imply, for example, that it was only or primarily that.
Right.
Also, when we speak like this, okay, so one of the things that was going on in the book I was reading is that the author was rarely speaking abstractly, right? He was grounding his discussion in specific cases, which is just an important thing to notice because when our discussions are abstract in that they are unanchored to a specific situation, and we're speaking in generalizations and so forth, I think it can be quite deceptive. I am inclined when doing that to forget that I'm being abstract, number one. Number two, that there's no such thing as an abstract situation. Those just don't exist. All situations are actual, intimate, real, and the kind of thinking that we do, which can be useful as long as we don't forget that it's different from actual situations. So yeah, that's my little homily about that. Say more or ask more about this freedom you spoke of, if you would.
Yeah. So the fear of death, I think, ties into the experience of love and transference in general. Because death and self-transformation are linked. So the experience of falling in love is a kind of transformative experience, or a self-transmogrifying experience, which is linked to a kind of suicide or death. So, perhaps everyone has a death instinct, or an instinct to overcome some kind of entrenched instinctual framework. Like, most of us are basically living on like instinctual autopilot,
Habitual
and
and instinctual, I would argue.
yes, right, yes, of course. And so I think I can identify in myself a certain kind of resistance, because I fear death, like any living thing, to certain forms of intimacy, as you were saying. So that's why I said that I can see it going both ways, I suppose. Well, so like transgenderism is perhaps merely an extension of the same kind of path that characterizes homosexuality. This kind of maybe self-enclosing and therefore liberating release from our environment. Because like as soon as you like castrate yourself, you're free from certain kinds of drives or impulses, more so than if you had kept your balls or whatever. So yeah, it's simultaneously liberating and self-enclosing in a way that can be its own kind of prison. So yeah, there's a kind of paradox there. But I think that dissonance, or that paradox, results from a more primitive kind of grievance or situation that within the psyche needs to be rectified. So you can try to rectify it by castrating yourself. That's one possible path. You can try to rectify it by engaging in homosexual relations. That's another possible path. I'm not really sure how to navigate those paths, but that's sort of what comes to my mind when I think about these subjects. But what about Burroughs were you curious to explore? I know very little about his private life. Just I've read a few things about his own accounts of his sexual escapades.
I don't know what was going on with him. I know a bit about his life and sexuality. He strikes me as an extreme. Okay. So Burroughs is a really fascinating character for a number of reasons. One of them is that he has a sense of justice and injustice. And by the way, let's just not forget that he was married, had a child, and accidentally shot his wife in the head while being drunk and playing William Tell with a revolver, a game they had played many times in the past. Let's just not forget those things, right? Because it's hard to imagine the psychic repercussions. Pun intended, right? The percussion of the revolver discharge, right? My God. Yeah, let's just keep those things in mind. I don't know a lot about his relationships prior to that event, though it's clear he had some, particularly probably with poets and writers, though also probably with actors. So Burroughs is a weird cat for a number of reasons. On the one hand, he He clearly has a conscience, something resembling a very alien kind of conscience, while at the same time gladly and publicly taking a piss on the ethics of the mob and their suppositions about morality, particularly as it regards sexuality.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, well,
He
there's
not only,
also a connection
go ahead.
between Burroughs and Crowley.
Let's hear it.
Well, you know, Burroughs believed that he was possessed. So he basically explained the accident involving his wife in terms of his own possession by this kind of spiritual force, which he was attempting to bring out through the cut-up method. That's why he tried to develop the method.
Oh, this is not familiar to me, though I may have been exposed to the idea previously.
Can you repeat the what method?
Cut up, right? Take a text, cut it up into bits, randomize them, put them back together piecemeal to produce what we might think of as magical, oracular, or spellcasting texts.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I have experimented with that method at great length. That shit is real. It is a method for doing what he describes. It's not a fantasy, in my view and experience. It actually led to the production of truly oracular texts that predicted future situations and relationships and so on, in my experience.
Right. Yeah, basically he believed that the way in which we use language actually eclipses certain forms of insight. So he was attempting to bring this demonic force within himself out through the cut-up method by overcoming the ways in which human language sort of preclude insight. So that was his, I think, one of his motivations. He was doing a form of magic, I think. He was doing something along the lines that Crowley outlined.
You know, what they meant by magic is just as weird as the difference between what angels are and what humans say.
Yeah, I think that was behind his premise that language is a virus from outer space. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
This whole notion of like a hyperstition.
Wow,
like fictions that make themselves real.
Yeah. By the way, when humans write books and make films, they generate futures. Those things are not just imaginal. There's no chance of that being true. But the humans don't really believe that. I was talking with Lee the other day about the story of a film called Man Facing Southeast. It's a very important film in my mind and world. And the supposition by the author and director that it was stolen to make the film K-Pax. And how...
Interesting. Can you... Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wasn't aware of that.
Are you aware of the film?
Yeah, yeah.
You know of Man Facing Southeast?
No, K-Pax.
Oh. I strongly recommend that you get a copy of Man Facing Southeast. I can arrange that if helpful. And this led to a very peculiar conversation in which it became apparent that the focus of her love interest is actually the character from the film who was born in the year the film was made. And I use this to support my theory that films, especially films like MFS, are not merely oracular, they generate future lines. And this is part of what Crowley and Burroughs were invested in.
Right. Yeah. So the whole mechanism by which fictions make themselves real, I think, involves feedback. So what Burroughs was doing involved feedback. He was taking his own output as the input of future operations. So he believed that he could basically engineer the future through this, yes, self-reinforcing feedback loop, which
Genius.
actually ties into his whole view of homosexuality. I think
Yes,
because the way in which he was describing his, sexual relations is totally consonant with that kind of operation.
indeed. That was that was a moment of genius on your part. I want to highlight that. Um, Burroughs and others recognized a feature of both cognition, of cognition, consciousness, awareness, and action that is primordial and largely unconsciously acknowledged by humans. You don't engage in an action that doesn't involve feedback. The nature of cognition is a feedback system. The nature of sensation is a feedback system. The nature of birth and death is a feedback system. The nature of dreaming and waking is a feedback system. These generate feedback loops, and they're not simple the way that technological feedback is simple. Say, for example, if you place the pickup of the guitar next to the speaker of the amplifier and produce a noise that way. Or if you, go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's like a magnifying glass. So what Burroughs was trying to do was to magnify this inner spirit to understand it. He was trying to bring it out, yeah, through feedback specifically.
Yeah, he was both invoking and evoking it. Mm. Also, I just want to point out here the difference between feedback in nature, or we could say existence, and feedback in mechanical systems. This strongly resembles the difference between what humans think of as fractals and what I don't actually have I should invent a neologism for this. What I observe in the relationship between the what I'll call origin, form, well, no, origin, being, form, my body, my hand, my fingertips. That relationship is not like a fractal. A fractal is the reiteration of formal tropes, right, over scales or, boy, when I start using filler words, you can tell that I'm having trouble. Scalar instancings of a principle. And in mathematical fractals, what you don't get, as far as I understand, I could be confused, are novel reinstancing of the principle in a functional variant at the register. That's the word I was looking for. At the register of the fractal, which we could think of as the iterative layers of a fractal system. So when humans look at computationally or mathematically evoked fractals, they don't see how nature's fractal systems work. And there should be a different word. I'm sure there actually is a better word, but I could invent one for what nature's doing, because it isn't a fractal as humans understand this concept. And I'm sure that both Crowley and Burroughs were uniquely aware in a preternatural way about this. Right? They were aware of this. They knew that feedback in nature or cognition or time or place, right? One of the things Burroughs did, which I think was genius, I learned so much from him, is he developed a system of vengeful action where he became aware that if you wanted to visit destruction on something, go to that person or place, make a recording, and then return to that person or place at a different time and play the recording back. This is an implementation of his understanding of feedback. It's a nefarious one. He gave no instances of a positive mode of this that I'm aware of, right? So this points up his awareness of feedback. Quite different also from what happens if you take the output of an active video feed and direct it to the input. So you take a camera that is feeding into, say, a computer monitor with an active video feed, and then you just point the camera at the monitor. And what it produces is a sort of infinite mirror effect that warps in interesting ways as you move the camera. Again, this is a feature of how feedback is in nature, but it is not the feature, not by a long shot. What happens in feedback in nature is a very peculiar thing, and I would argue that the problems with the double slit experiment have directly to do with this. We expect the feedback. We're not actually perceiving that a feedback is occurring, right? We just think of the photons like bullets. You shoot them at the slits, and they do different things. Whether depending on whether you're shooting them one at a time, and how you arrange the situation in terms of sensors. We're not realizing that you can't do anything with light that doesn't produce feedback in light, because light is so primordial that if you mess with it, you're messing with yourself. There's no way to separate yourself from the light, right? And it's the same problem with time. You cannot mess with time from outside it. George, I need to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, precisely. We ordinarily think of time as something like a container that moves steadily according to some kind of array of homogeneous units, using something like seconds. So the way in which we conceive of time is usually already confused because...
Not usually. No, it's completely fucking backwards, inside out, amputated. It's like just ridiculous nonsense. Yeah.
Right. So the form of the body is already a matter of feedback.
Right.
So the appearance of a certain form is already the product of a feedback process or a loop.
Yeah, this goes to our ontological discussions.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, so that's where I would try to go with it.
Yeah, and I agree. So the forms are like waves of character, intelligence, history, and futurity arriving locally and in structuring over what we think of as time, but not the kind of time we think of, right? There are other kinds of time, right? Like, so the form of the tree is like a wave that keeps acquiring new feedback anomalisms and novelties over some span through which we could observe it in linear time. But it is not a linear time thing. It's a kind of time, a mode of time, a species of time that is unlike our suppositions about linear temporality or clock time.
Right. Yeah, the being is a form of time itself, but
Right.
we ordinarily imagine that time continues to tick irrespective of change. So we basically separate the passage of time from what takes place within perception. So, yeah, this is why I mentioned that, time is ordinarily regarded as a container within which changes take place. But that point of view can't be right.
Yeah, it's thought of as a continuum. It's not thought of as a field. It should be thought of as a field. It should be thought of as a relational field. It should be thought of as a field impregnated by the characters and intelligences of origin and being and relational intimacy. One thing I would argue is that the humans, we have this bad problem with individual things. We're really stupid about this. And it's not that there aren't individual things, it's just that doesn't have precedence. And what has precedence is so insane that it's no wonder we made up some bullshit about it. I would argue that a tree is not just receiving time waves of encharactering, fertilizing, form instruction from origin, time, space, being. It's also receiving moment-to-moment transformations from all trees that ever existed and that presently exist on Earth. And probably from trees that don't yet exist.
Right. Yeah. Like we understand the flow of time by analogy with space. So we look at a field in darkness,
Mm-hmm.
and then we superimpose some kind of grid, some kind of abstract phase space that can be plotted on graph paper. So this all comes from Descartes. But we understand time similarly. So we think that changes take place, and then over transformation, we superimpose some kind of grid, some kind of array
Yeah.
of homogeneous units.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think, in fact, the being itself is the true metric. So when you look at a tree, you see the actual metric itself, the actual unit. So the unit isn't superimposed, the unit is already present within perception, it's already there. so precisely because the form of the tree at a deeper layer is actually a kind of waveform, but that
Mm-hmm.
waveform has a certain periodicity, which is the unit. So the unit is already present. It's not superimposed in the form of a second or something like that, or a meter. It's already, you're already downstream from the deeper cause by the time you arrive at that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But there appears to be more than one metric, in the same way
Yeah.
that there appear to be more than one kind of being. So yeah, and there's something about it which appears to be scalar, as you were saying. So what distinguishes beings is something like scale. And we've delved into this before in terms of Kleiber's law and certain other power laws in nature.
Talk about Kleiber's law.
So Kleiber's law expresses a relationship between the size of an organism and its metabolic rate. So that relationship is actually nonlinear. I think it's a power of 3/4.
Hmm.
So the metabolic rate of an organism increases with its mass or its surface area, but that proportion isn't linear. It's like, I think it's logarithmic. So the larger an organism becomes, the slower its metabolic rate, but it isn't a linear correspondence. So
Yes, this is. Hang on a second. I'm gonna wait for the siren to pass. So this is the basis of something Toymaker gave me to see, as if when Toymaker gave me to see something, it was as if I became the process I was looking at and saw from as the process, not from outside it, which is how we usually see, I think. And what he gave me to see was that different sizes of organisms experience even linear time quite differently. And as you say, I would argue that they don't experience time, they are time.
Mhm.
It's my perspective that organisms are to time as stars are to light. They produce modes of time. And their size is also, one more moment here. Their size, their physical size, just to give an example so this isn't invisible. From this perspective, the quote amount of time experienced by a fruit fly that lives for, say, 17 hours, and an elephant that lives for 110 years. From this perspective, they both experience, quote, the same amount of time in a lifespan. This is one way of thinking about it. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's useful to think this way. And the difference between the fruit fly and the elephant in the case that I just made is geometrically magnified by the difference between a cell and a fruit fly, or a virus and a cell. So these features of nature, these forms in nature, are modes of time. And that time isn't a thing. We should think of it more like an angel or a god or a feature of God, or it's a being. Time is a being, an entity, if you will, in my preferred view, though I'm happy to think of it in other ways. If humans were intelligent, they would worship time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they would want to talk with time. They would want time to know them and to relate with them and to confer with them. And as you say, it's not as if there's a single metric. This is something that is also dumb that we are trained to do, which is like, what's the metric? You know, there's no single metric. There are angles of approach which we would be wise to maintain multiple of, at least 5, simultaneously. And we could easily train each other and our children to do this. We just train them to do the opposite thing. There are angles of approach from which we see multiple important metrics, and we can switch around between giving primacy to 1 or 2 or 3 of the metrics, instead of saying, oh, this is the metric, right? And whenever we do that, we're going to get more intelligent, because we're so used to single valued metricity. Right? Oh, this is the thing. It's the clock second. Right? It's the speed of light. So yeah, there are multiple metrics, and the metric or series of them that gains importance depends on our purpose in analysis. And deciding that the obvious metric is the important one is a way to get dumber fast. It's not that it isn't important, but when it becomes single valued, we are amputating our capacity for insight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the image of the external world, I think, is time itself. But the image of the external world is a function of the spatiality of the body. So the present moment is really indistinguishable from the physical form or the physical mantle. But the present moment, therefore, is more than just a point. So so we tend to think, even Aristotle, even Aristotle regarded the present moment as a kind of point on a line. But the present moment is really a kind of interval. So it has a kind of width or depth. which I think proceeds from the spatiality of the body. So as you increase or concentrate the spatiality of the body, time itself changes, and therefore the image of the external world changes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And some traditions would ask us to do away in cognition with all of these things and focus awareness groundlessly in presence, in instantaneity. Not the moment, right? Because the moment is a slice. Instantaneity, it's very difficult to cognize because it is not graspable.
This is where the angel lives.
Yes.
This is where the magic happens.
Yes, the angels don't have knowledge because there is no past. There is no future. They can relate with me as if there's a past and a future for my sake, because I think that way. But for them, they don't have knowledge. Knowledge is a post facto thing. To be rather crass about it, they are fucking time.
One thing that's well, just briefly, I don't know if this is just fodder, but in engineering, I found it really interesting, inspiring how of course we learned Descartes' coordinate system, and I'm curious, I assume, George, you might already be familiar with radial or cylindrical or other forms of coordinate systems. And I was curious if Darren, if you've thought about this in the same sort of way. Have you guys heard of radial coordinates, cylindrical coordinates, other coordinate schemas?
Yes, and I'm a math idiot, but the very first communication from Toymaker radically transformed everything I'd ever thought about coordinates and unified them and provided a simultaneous dimensionalized demonstration of point to line to disk to sphere to the impossible. Those layers. Yeah, actually, point to line to cross to disk to sphere to the impossible. Go ahead.
It's certainly really interesting that the inculcation of humans in this society involves like a multi-factored, line coordinate system, like the deadest of them all.
Mm-hmm.
The one that presumes no center, right? And that's really interesting to me, as this kind of normal sense of space, might be better understood in a radial coordinate system. But what's more interesting to me is just relating this back to what you were saying before about feedback, but not the good feedback, the fractal systems, the kind of way.
The mechanical derivations.
Yeah, because in that same sort of way, the kind of fractals that people are familiar with are dead on one end of the equation, right? You give it input, it produces output. There's it simply has a function. It's made a machine of itself. So we have these beautiful fractals, people make art out of them, and it's really interesting, but it's dead. It's merely a function. And so what's really interesting, of course, is when it's not merely a tool or an extension of the thought or, the equation or the, I don't know, when it's not a dead extension of the agent, but when there's actual feedback, when there's interplay.
Yes, improv, right?
Say it again. What was the last part?
Improvisation,
Yeah,
play.
the relationship is there,
Yeah.
and both ends are alive. You
Yeah,
know,
this creates the third space, what I call the third mind,
it
which is
seems
not
like,
mine.
maybe the universe better understood as living within that space. Of course, it's not dead on either end. We may simplify it, for any range of motivations, but it's interesting to me how when I view the tree, the closer I look at it, the more detailed it becomes,
Hmm.
the more it impresses itself upon me.
And also the transformation of form, right? You see a principle uniquely instanced at each register and with unique capacities and functions at each register of magnification or distance.
Yeah, somehow we're both beings in time.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow we're both agents of each other's change.
Yes, but imagine how confused the humans are about trees.
Oh yeah, I mean lumberjacks see dollar signs instead of canopies.
Yeah. But there's a specific feature I want to highlight. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are born and will live and die as a tree. Okay. So there are trees that don't have this experience. Trees that are transported in pots or trees that are dug up and moved. But for all other trees, you will live and die in one specific place. So your relationship to place and time is entirely different from anything that can move around. And there is nothing other than like a mountain or a stone that can possibly exist over a vast temporality without moving. So its intimacy, it becomes that place's expression of its intimacy with all other things. Also, it cannot affect doodly fuck about its environment in terms of threats. It cannot mediate threats. Now, I'm not saying it has no capacity to mediate threats, but physically, right? So the form of vigilance that it employs in its awareness is completely different from something that's all about mediating threats. The tree cannot mediate threats physically. Well, again, there are capacities of trees that do watch over and mediate certain kinds of threats, but not in the way that, for example, a human can. And most of the threats the tree will face are human, results of human behavior. So they must be really interested in relating with humans, since most of the threat space comes from that species. There are other species that comprise the threat space. But the mode of its vigilance must be very different from a being that can move around. And therefore, contacting that intelligence should be one of the most important things to do if you are a being concerned about intelligence. Right? Because that's a really unique form. It can't move.
It subsumes threats. It infiltrates threats. It embraces threats.
I also once had the peculiar, I was writing this story called Tony's Angel, which I never finished. It's about a guy who inherits a house, has a basement, and he's a musician. He meets another musician, brings him over to his house and shows him this thing in his room. One day he woke up from sleep and there was a prepared canvas in his bedroom. The next day when he went to sleep and woke up, there was some, more preparation. And over time, as he kept sleeping and waking up, an image was appearing on the canvas. And it's an image that he thinks of as an angel. And it turns out that this angel, quote, lives in his basement, unquote. But one of the things that occurred to me when I was working on this story in my 30s, early 30s, was that what if an angel is a being that is absolutely still relative to all beings that move? What if its stillness is actually composed by the movement of all things that can move? Right? Its stillness is simply the shadow of that movement in every possible form of movement that arises over the life of what we think of as the universe or the everything.
Well, I know that Georgia spent a lot of time meditating on plants and how they reveal the truer nature of the universe. I don't know if you were coming off mute earlier, but it seems like apropos.
Yeah, Darren, do you think of something like a berry center?
Kindly elucidate the meaning of that word.
So the barycenter is basically just the center of mass between multiple revolving bodies in astronomy.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that word or idea, but yes, that's very similar. It was a stillness defined by the movement of anything that moves in this toy, right, of perspective. Also, what did you mean earlier by the use of the word hyperstition? That was a fascinating neologism I'd never encountered before. I think maybe it's not a neologism.
Yeah, I think well, the whole concept of hyperstition was, I think, popularized by Nick Land. But basically, hyperstition is the phenomenon whereby through fiction, an author can influence the future through feedback, as I mentioned. So I think even like alternate reality games are examples of hyperstition because an alternate reality game attempts to engineer the future through this primordial work of fiction that becomes real of its own dynamism. So it works sort of like an egregore, if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm. With the idea, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the whole notion of hyperstition is becoming more common in um, the magical community for that reason, because I think Burroughs was also essentially doing it. Even like Philip K. Dick, we've mentioned this before. Yeah, Philip K. Dick had certain accounts in which he wrote a book and then he met characters from his book in real life. They would like come to his doorstep. Are you familiar with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I am familiar with that because I've had the experience.
Yeah, that's basically what hyperstition encompasses. It's that kind of process.
I see. Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's usually associated with chaos magic. People like Robert Anton Wilson.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be a little distracted for just a moment.
Well, I was curious to pick up on the tree and the berry center. You know, George, do you think that the image of the external world is the berry center?
No, I suspect that the image of the external world issues from a more primordial layer, which is immaterial. So what we perceive as matter is already the product of a more primordial cause. which is bound up with some kind of wave-like motion that exhibits holographic properties. So the image of the external world is a kind of holographic production. But I think people like Karl Pribram, who claim that the brain is a hologram, essentially take a certain misstep. So the brain isn't a hologram. Rather, your body is a kind of wave. So what you perceive as your physical mantle isn't your true essence. I mean, this is an old idea, but yeah, essentially, your material body is coextensive with the image of the external world, but they both issue from the same cause. So the image of the external world isn't generated by the brain or encoded in the brain. So basically, what I think takes place is a kind of suppression or inhibition of real action in the external field. And that inhibition takes the form of something like a wave or an interference pattern. So what we perceive is really the function of the suppression of activity. So nothing is really being generated by the brain. Something is rather being inhibited. So the propagation of a signal of some kind actually engenders a whole image, and that wholeness issues from a deeper kind of layer. So the visual field is an integral whole that contains certain harmonies or proportions over time, or a certain kind of logic, I think, that can be brought out through phenomena like color, specifically. But I think it also takes place within the form of the body, so the morphology of the body, its actual proportions. So those proportions reflect a wave-like structure that never incarnates as an object, but which is rather requisite to the incarnation of objects. And yeah, so you can see the waveform physically, but you can also perceive it in other ways beyond the physical body, like at the moment of death. That's my suspicion.
If we, let me think about how to formulate this question then.
Yeah, so like neuroscientists claim that the image of the external world is the function of some kind of signal, electrochemical signal within your body and brain. So there exists some kind of vibration in the external world, which is particulate. There is some kind of so there are particles of some kind in the external world that stimulate nerve endings, which generate like some kind of electrochemical signal that moves to the center of your body within your brain. And that signal needs to be encoded or decoded, like even like Elon Musk, who I think is totally stupid, but Elon Musk talks about compression. So his whole like theory of like the whole basis of Neuralink is bound up with this idea of compressing information. But I think information theory is incorrect in its assessment of information itself, because compression is really bound up with the whole concept of information, which I don't think is actually happening. So nothing is really being compressed or decompressed by the brain. But that's the stance of modern neuroscience. It's the idea that, well, what we perceive is really some kind of product of our own organism. So when I perceive a color like magenta, both the physician and the physiologist or the physicist, would claim that the appearance of magenta as a color is like other qualia. It sort of arises through the organism without having any kind of, objective existence or external cause. So basically, the neurologist localizes the cause of certain qualia to the body, and I think that step is based on a misunderstanding. So
The piece that I'm trying to track down here is about the barycenter between these, beings in time. And, as we interact together, as I interact with the tree, and, in the sense of even merely viewing it. But of course, it impresses itself upon my awareness and vice versa. Why did you call out the barycenter? What is beyond the nature of our relationship, which I tend to think of as light itself, the kind of co-moment, the influence. What is it about the barycenter that you thought was interesting?
Oh, it just immediately came to mind.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, so I
It
figured
was
I'd bring it
it
up.
was a result of the toy about the angel's stillness, right? That its position was a position of absolute non-movingness generated by the movement of all other beings or things or situations, so forth, even time. I think that's what brought up. Then George asked me if that was relevant to the barycenter.
What you were describing immediately reminded me of that. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you asked me recently about planets, so I figured that maybe something in my psyche wanted to bring that out for you.
One
Go
thing that's
ahead.
interesting to me, at least, is this kind of thought experiment. You can get this in video games at times, right? But if I was to understand the world in terms of a radial sort of symmetry, a radial set of coordinates, then it's interesting. It's fascinating to me. And I'm working from a normative conception of physics here, so please forgive the rough edges and troubles. Um, right now, I love to pace when and this is kind of interesting to me too. I love to pace when I'm on a call or
I'm the
talking.
same way. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I got to move. And what's interesting about the idea of this radial symmetry is that although I've been trained, and it may appear in a way to me that I move myself about the room, I move myself about the earth. I go up or down on the earth, but I could take the center, of course, to be me. And I notice how my legs move the earth under me. I
Mm-hmm.
notice how, well, you get the idea. Um, Now, of course, any of these symmetry systems, deaden one end of the situation, right? And so it's interesting to understand what is the center of gravity. What is the relational center between me and any other thing, but of course, living things too. So I guess that's what really piqued my curiosity when you brought up the barycenter. But I don't know if it can be further resolved or addressed, but that was behind my question.
Where is the center that determines what's moving? And this is one of the unspoken questions, excuse me, that led to my strange perspective on the relationship of the angel to movement.
Right.
What determines what's moving? And there's a feature of this that is important in understanding the nature of time. One of the things that's also important in understanding that for me is the idea of non-simultaneity in relativity, which I'll try to very simply state as I think I've probably misunderstood this, but also the part that I have understood is useful, which is that no two points in space or observers can actually have the same experience at all. And they certainly cannot have the same experience at the same time. In order for them to have the same experience at the same time, they would have to have the same world line, which we would usefully imagine to be not possible. That non-simultaneity makes it obvious that beings are time beings and that time is generated by them. But that last thing I said doesn't emerge necessarily from non-simultaneity. It emerges from the perspective that asks the question, if there were just one thing, could there be time? Temporality appears to be the result of a relationship between things.
Yeah, exactly.
And so once you have two things, you can have time, but you can't have time if there's just one. Of course, it's extremely difficult to imagine what there being just one thing would be like. I dare you to try it. It's not going to go well. You can do it trivially. You can say, well, I just suppose that there's just one thing. Yeah, fine, okay. But to actually try to imagine that in any meaningful way is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So time is the relationship between different things. However, it has occurred to me just now for the first time, that there might be a transcendental thing which isn't the time that arises between two things or as the relationship, but is rather the possibility of temporality, which is again impossible to imagine. But I could imagine a being existing in some very difficult to understand transcendental state that is much like the possibility of direction, that is the possibility of time. And I've never had that thought before.
Yeah. Well, the issue for me with general relativity is that the idea of non-simultaneity for Einstein is bound up with time dilation, which is really a measurement effect in general relativity, as opposed to an ontological transformation. Because time dilation is linked to length contraction. So essentially, within general relativity, you already need to suppose that both space and time can be subordinated to something like units, which I think is somewhat mistaken, because what I think takes place in the metamorphosis of a living being is something like true ontological transformation, as opposed to a measurement effect. So the whole point of general relativity is to synchronize clocks. So the purpose of contrasting time dilation with length contraction is merely to allow clocks to become synchronized, which is the foundation of what we usually mean by non-simultaneity in general relativity. So that framework, I think, is somewhat inadequate to understanding a living system, because the metamorphosis of a plant, for example, is a true ontological change, which is non-relativistic. I mean, so the blossoming of a rose is a true ontological transformation. So for me, like, general relativity never actually enters the picture there.
Yeah, I'm sure this is just to say it in another way, right? But like, the nature of synchronizing the clocks is to pin reality to the metric, just as measuring space by the meter is to pin reality to that dead end.
Right, exactly. Yes, yeah.
In that way, of course, you confuse reality entirely, right? So I think it's a lot more challenging to try to understand time space as this kind of mutually squishy, this mutually relative kind of interplay. But it kind of seems to me like it's inside of consciousness already. So of course, like trying to imagine time and space in these kind of terms because it's pinned to a dead thing is already misleading.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. So the
Oh, by
expansion
the
and the
way, there's something.
contractions really happen. They really take place in space,
Uh,
irrespective of your own motion.
yeah.
Precisely because your perception of space is a reflection of your own form. But that form is nothing material. It's not just your body. I mean, yeah.
This is so brilliant. By the way, this is a great example of what happens when political conversations don't pervade over the entire space here.
Yeah, the horizontal is interesting, but the vertical is transcendental, right?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so that example of linking simultaneity to the desire to synchronize clocks is a brilliant example of what happens to perspective under the aegis of purposive agenda, right? So effectively, the desire to synchronize clocks becomes all consuming. It's sort of like a hard on in the mind. And
Yeah,
then
exactly.
once that rigid point is established, then we try to sort of massage the rest of reality around it to not allow it to threaten that rigid point. God, what was occurring to me? Right. Renormalization is a feature of this in quantum physics that Dirac despised. And other people definitely were like, yeah, if we're going to have to do this renormalization thing, we're idiots and don't understand what's going on. Which is, you throw away a bunch of infinities in the beginning of the mathematical process, and then at the end, you re-add them. Which basically means like you have no idea what the fuck is going on. You just have a tool that allows you to negotiate a mathematic space in order to produce results that are consistent and mechanically implementable. Yeah, it's a great example of, look, the important thing is synchronizing clocks. We don't want to know what's actually going on, right? We just want to synchronize some clocks, bro.
Right.
Again, it's a tool, technology.
Yeah, it's a technique, it's a method, right? And the method's useful, but its usefulness is deceptive because then we think, oh, well, the method tells us what's going on. No, it fucking doesn't. You threw away most of what's going on to produce the method. Can we just keep that in mind as we proceed down this ever more slippery slope?
It's that strange gravity again.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's also the thing that I was talking about earlier where humans want a familiar role. They don't want to improvise. They don't know what happens if you do that, right? So the familiarity of the role, establish a purpose, establish a metric, and then sort of blur the rest of what's going on until the metric appears authoritative. This is one of the minefields of analytical cognition, right? Very useful for what it's useful for, devastating if it pervades over the entire possibility space and dominates it. This is also why it's useful to maintain multiple purposive orientations in analysis. I love when George makes a certain specific sound before he begins explicating something. And I think he made it, but even if he didn't, the words he used were sufficient. when George goes, my issue with relativity, I'm like, okay, here we go. Right, let's go. George has a UFO. We're going to get inside that fucker. We're going to, we're going. when George has an issue with something, insight is on the fucking menu.
Yeah, well, I mentioned recently how the plant, in its growth, actually harmonizes light with gravity. So you can see the interplay between light and gravity within the body of a growing plant. Um, so the plant itself is something like a polar coordinate system because it exhibits a kind of polarity over time. Um, in a way that I think is periodic. So, yeah. So that period is the true unit of measurement. It's not something that you superimpose over your perception of space and time.
Yeah, but it's hyperstitious.
Right. Yes.
It's
Yeah.
interesting how the cycles of the environment, the universe, the cosmos, whatever, the plant finds resonance with those cycles, right? And in doing so becomes something very interesting that was not before. The angel, I don't know. I don't know if that resonates with anything.
Say it again, please.
Well, I haven't mapped out this entire ontology, but here's something that's, and of course that would be silly. Here's something that's interesting to me, though. What is experiences, the influences, the forces of the universe? Whatever we may take that to be. And the cycles of the sun and the water, to speak really in very kind of dead terms, very normative terms here. And the availability, of the energy and the material. Those have a rhythm, right? And the rhythm implies time. So as the world strikes its rhythm, the plant emerges as a sort of resonance with that time and those elements and forces, right? The plant is a perspective on the availabilities and the influences.
Right. Yeah, and that resonance opens the possibility of interaction and relation.
Yeah,
It also... Oh, go ahead.
He is saying the moreness, the becoming, the angel.
No, but you started to say the angel. Yeah, I want to hear about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, huh?
No, say what you're going to say about the angel.
I mean, there's I don't have anything to say except that there's a spirit behind all this.
Yeah.
There's matter does not precede existence. It's the other way around.
Right. There's something that's been missing in the conversation, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm very curious about the feature of your consciousness, Cornfed, that made the apology. I haven't worked out the entire ontology. Because I'd really like to talk to that person. What's his job? What's his job? To apologize for the incompleteness of your cognition? Is that his job?
Well, there's a thing behind that.
Okay.
And here is it. So, I've had a few conversations with George here, and I've listened, I think, to most of your conversations that have been posted online as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I would consider myself the kind of person who's had a lot of training in the normative scientific perspective.
Oh,
And,
okay.
my training has been diverse enough that I don't tend to view science from the kind of scientism lens that most people get it. I've participated in research and kind of seen the, science itself. It's an effort to pin down things. It's, I kind of mentioned the explanation maybe last time we spoke, which is a scientist tries to explain something very simple and very complex terms, right? Very detailed.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I think good scientists or smart scientists recognize the interplay and the kind of loose ends and the limitations and the vast space that exists beyond that, right? It's to try to characterize whatever you can pin down. And of course, that's the underwhelming minority of anything. And that itself is kind of a limiting approach and perspective, blah, 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 whatever. So, I'm very well versed in all that. So what, if I may be so bold, what has been really interesting to me is to get better and better views of George's ontology and some of the background, the underpinning, the metaphysical nature of it. I think in a lot of ways, what it does is it turns that scientific perspective inside out, right? It approaches it from at least the other direction, if not more directions. If directions is even a thing that you could say, it more like infuses an understanding of reality from within it, as opposed to anchoring it and then weighing it, So I say that because I'd been looking forward to at some point, a conversation where I could just kind of map out that whole thing as, again, using weird words as best as I understand it, and kind of see if that, matches what George has been working to convey or not. Right. But because I'm mindful that, I don't think that I have it all yet, nor would I ever, nor could one, who is not entirely sophomoric, ever proclaim to. The interesting thing about what you said, of course, is the fact that reality, whatever this experience is, will always escape, subsume and expand beyond however we might ascribe it. So, I have to use words, but I don't pretend to say, oh, I got it all. As soon as you do, right, like you're looking for the margins where it creeps out and you're looking for the nuance and the detail underneath what you said. I mean, that's the beauty of being alive. So, that's my response from several angles.
So one of the reasons why I asked, in a somewhat snide way, right? Like, well, let me talk to this guy. Who's this guy? Who said that? Is that there are features of our cognition, and I think they're both natural and troubling, that are there are critical satellites over our speech, and they are not speakers. They are not me. They're not you. They are a sort of restrictive intelligence that's a simulation of how people who aren't here with us right now might take this wrong. Right? And so when you said, like, well, I haven't done all the whole ontology thing, I was curious because I have features like this myself, And sometimes those features become so prevalent that I actually lose in my apology for the incompleteness or for the non-universality of what I'm about to say, or for the unpolitical correctness of my next few words. I actually lose the thing that I was trying to say because my attention becomes consumed by this critical satellite voice thing, which simulates the possible negative attention of conceivable others, usually who are not present here with me, and how what I'm about to say next could be misinterpreted. And it's ironic when that concern actually obviates my capacity to say what the fuck I was thinking, right? It just takes over the whole, it takes over the production to the degree that I lose the insight I was about to speak. This happened to me in a conversation the other night. So I just marvel at that feature of our, I think it's a form of social cognition. We simulate, there are features of our minds that simulate the observation of putative or nominal others. And I wouldn't want it to go away, but if it becomes too prevalent, it can be quite problematical.
Yeah. You know, I try to reach into the minds of the people I'm with to try to understand and ward off problems. And of course, that's always going to be, to some degree, misplaced. And at the same time, too, other minds reach into me. You know, I contain multitudes, as we all do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even convinced any of them are mine,
Mm-hmm.
which is, you know, at least very few, if any of them, are even mine in the first place. But, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm aware of the propensity, and I always, you know, appreciate blind spots being brought forward to me. Well,
So
I wouldn't say always about anything, but you know.
see, there it is. Yeah. Was that a joke?
It's all kind of a joke, no?
Yeah, but that was really funny because then you did the exact thing we were talking about right at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I cherish this ability to kind of question even while stating. I think that's important for me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing that was in the background that I managed to bookmark, I think, was the way we've been talking about the plant as a resonance. I think, or as resonant, or, you know, a hyperstitious harmonization of waves landing locally as and in the plant. I think we should also just note that there isn't anything that isn't the plant. We are disinclined to think this way.
The trouble with what? With things.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There isn't anything that isn't the plant. There isn't anything that isn't the tree. And it's a problem in our perspective. Neither you nor the ground beneath you are moving. Your movement is all movements. Now this is a universalization of a property which humans naturally and often intelligently resist. That's me doing the thing we were just talking about. When I say there isn't anything that isn't the plant, what I'm trying to do is amend what I see as a conceivably dangerous misconception, which is that the plant is a separate thing. And if the moment of singularity in my dandelion toy has precedence over distinction, then the plant is not a separate thing. Right? If everything collapses to God spec and then re-expands to the appearance of distinction catastrophically more frequent times per second, or picosecond or whatever, then most of the time everything is one thing, and a tiny part of the time it appears distinct.
Right.
And so there isn't anything that isn't the plant. There isn't anything that isn't the dog, that isn't the nail, that isn't the hammer. There aren't any things.
Yeah, I think it probably stems from the act of pointing or ostension, because the treatment of the plant in taxonomy is similar to how, general relativity treats space. So,
Right.
you might perceive the plant and then use your index finger to point around certain regions and then attribute certain names to those regions.
I've watched you do that specific thing in meat space.
Right. But digital thinking is obviously bound up with tool use, which is why general relativity is essentially just a computer or a tool. But I think taxonomy is quite similar. So it basically stems from the left hemisphere at some level.
It
And it was
does.
probably bound up with our evolution. So the evolution of our fingers and a certain form of cognition that was probably pertinent to hunting go together in our minds. So what we perceive as, the proliferation of technology in modern science is really just downstream from that kind of connection. So yeah, to see a plant and then to immediately decompose it into like an assemblage of parts with names is really just an extension of the same kind of thinking in our ancestry and in the deep past that enabled us to, hunt animals. But it's a limited domain. It's not, an ontology.
That was a very ostentatious lecture on ostension.
I have a, I don't know if you would like to go somewhere with this, Xerxes, but I had a question kind of related to this. Even in fact, a question and a half.
Ooh.
I know, right?
My feelers are all charged up. I'm starting to feel rigid. I'm getting rigid over here. My tongue's getting hard. Let's go.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. The you gotta nurture the desire before the fulfillment. But okay.
Actually, you should probably avoid the fulfillment.
Yeah. Indeed. Good call.
Stay rigid, bro.
Among other things.
Keep that pointer.
This question was first inspired, I think, by your guys' chat posted online about ontology, and
By the way, which got mad views.
Why were they angry?
Fucking, what are you, an autistic?
I know.
Oh.
JD put out that quiz, and I tested, nowhere near it, but I still wonder a little bit. But anyway, so I think we've gravitated around this way of understanding life quite a bit, over our calls, over our chats. The way that I often approach it and describe it is that, I'm not, as we try to disarm ourselves of the trouble of that and what and the pointing of the staff, of all
okay, I want to be really clear about something briefly. Can you hold your thought for a sec?
Sure.
Please. I don't want to get rid of ostension or digital thought. I want the precedence. I want to train us to the precedence of unity first so that we have that option. Go ahead.
Yeah, agreed. Like, they are in a way poles of each other. They're not. What? So we cut off our awareness of unity, and so to compensate, we're going to cut off our awareness of specificity instead. That's crazy.
Right. No, yeah, it's the same fucking problem. It's the one-winged bird syndrome. Go ahead.
I haven't
Come
read
back
any
to your
Gilchrist, but I'm sure. I'm sure he just kind of approaches this ad nauseum.
Sure, but come back to your thought that I interrupted you around, please, if you would.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, as I think about it, I often describe, corn-fed, the human, and again, like saying the human, that's ridiculous. Whatever this experience is, it is the intersection and convening space of, untold tens of thousands of years of sunlight, of, creatures and their energies and the molecules and the beings they constructed throughout the aeons.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the, some kind of end of the, co-development of some, not just human species, but like all of my gut microbiome, the yeast that lives on my skin. And even beyond that, of course, it pervades all the way into all of my distal extension, the murmurings of my mouth that fly through the ether on these electrons and strike your eardrums. That is me also, but it's also not just me, of course. It's, you have to hear it for me to be a thing at all, right? And in so many ways, I'm kind of, at this convening space, in one way, there's some kind of flesh body,
Mm-hmm.
And in this convening space, in one way, there's some kind of spirit still. And so you guys were talking about the true nature of environments. And I think this, again, just ties back to our conversations in multiple ways so far, which is why I wanted to raise it now, which is the sense, first off, that the plant, its center, somehow is its entire context. Like you were describing how you can't get up and move around, per se.
Mm.
So, what's interesting, if we're to, and I'm not saying isolate it, I really hate this kind of language, but if we're to take an environment, then it occurs to me that the rhythm of that environment, time with that environment produces is not even the right word, but that relationship manifests the complex dynamic of interplay, which is the plant, right?
Mm.
But, this question is about the center, to tee this up for George, because what's interesting to me is while the environment complexifies and the spirit is evoked into this life form of the plant, what's interesting is the way the environment calves like an iceberg, like a glacier calves icebergs. The environment calves animals.
Mm-hmm.
So it calves a center that can run around, right? So, I'm not certain I've ever really understood what you meant, George, in the sense of, like, how does this center relate to these themes of the environment and the plant and the animal? Like, it's obvious what it is in the animal, but the center of perception in the animal, of course, comes from this. So then I'm curious, to see the perception of the environment or of the plant. And then the second half question, this is this really, this is more political probably. But then if we, whatever we are calved of our environment, and you look at the modern human and you think about the environment that calved that, that nexus of beings, that's an interesting question too. That's not, that's a very different thing. But anyway, just about the center versus the non-centeredness of the environment or the plant. if that makes any sort of sense as a question.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, the distinction between an organism and its environment, I think, is somewhat artificial.
Yeah,
Can
exactly.
I ask you something right there?
Yeah.
What about the distinction between organism and mechanism?
Well, yeah, so I mean, the Cartesian notion that animals are machines, I think, is totally dubious, but I see the evolution of technology by analogy with the evolution of living systems, which I think is a natural consequence of regarding evolution as a form of feedback in the first place. So, what takes place in cognition is distinguished from what appears in the external world merely by virtue of something like feedback, in my view. So, the invisibility of thought takes place not because thought is insubstantial or unreal, but because requisite to the manifestation of anything is this kind of feedback mechanism. So, through feedback, more beings can appear within the visual field, I think. But what ordinarily takes place in, waking consciousness is solidified by some kind of deeper, substrate within the body. But what I mean when I say the body is something different from the physical form. Um, does that make any sense? So basically, the evolution of technology is an extension of human cognition, but I would question from there the distinction between cognition and the form of the body. I think that cognition or perception in general and the form of the body are intimately linked. They form a single continuum. So yeah, so therefore, the evolution of technology is intelligible in terms of the same kinds of laws that might describe, the evolution of a living system. Does that make sense? Or is that incoherent?
I'm reminded of the concretization and the armoring stuff that we talked about in the past.
Yeah,
And
right.
yeah, I think it's helpful for me when I first heard that. It's it took a while of thinking about it, but I think it's helpful to understand that as an extension of the mental and particularly the tool, left brain aspect of humanity, as opposed to being some more deeper fundamental aspect of reality. It just accords to the same laws as you said, I think. But check me if I'm wrong, and I just put that out there for what it's worth.
What was your original question, Cornfed?
Just relating back to, okay, so the animal has this center of perception, you know, and
Right. Yes. Yes. Right.
the plant and the environment, you know, don't. And so, like I love this, and I'm kind of like, um, you know, I think I've long kind of pondered the way that the environment feels and senses, but yeah, that's the question really.
Right. Yeah. So in my view, a plant effectively loses itself in matter. So in my view, a plant really lacks a definite center. So its living principle stems not from some kind of discrete center within its body. I think that development takes place later. So in the animal kingdom, I think you begin to see something like a center form within the material mantle or physical sheath, the morphology of the body. But that center moves around as opposed to being stationary. So the evolution of a living system, like a species or speciation, I think can be described in one sense in terms of the motion of that center. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me, and maybe this is just by way of analogy, right? But like, it always kind of blew my mind. We think a lot about eating, right? It's kind of a natural thing. And our conception of eating is that we take things and put them inside of us. Again, these are poor definitions, right? Us, inside. And that's the interesting part. It's interesting to learn about echinoderms like starfish that they take their stomach and put it outside of them to
So do
swallow.
wasps.
Oh, really?
Wasps, yeah, they don't have a digestive system internally. They eject. They have a bag that sort of contains all the juices, and they just bite it and inject that into what they're biting, and then it dissolves it, and they suck it back up.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I didn't realize that about wasps. But then, very closely related to us meat bodies, again, us is the wrong word there, is fungus. And what's really interesting about fungus is, if we're one way and the echinoderm and the wasp are about halfway to the other side, they're on the line, then the fungus is fully on the other side of the line, where its digestion is external. It simply secretes into the environment and allows nutrients to come back in, whatever in means, because now it's made the environment itself its stomach. And, I know worms are discrete beings, but there's this great poem, I need to find it again and write it down, but it's about the sensuousness. Today, you and I are tasting the chocolate. It fills our mouths. We taste the pork and we taste its sweetness and its texture. And it's important to remember that one day we will be tasted by the environment. The tongues of the earth will consume us, and the taster will be tasted.
Right. Yeah, I tend to play with the idea that the tree of life could be reformulated in terms of the motion of something like that center, as opposed to constructing some kind of genetic tree. Um, you could imagine a tree of life in which the form of an organism is understood or classified according to the emphasis of certain regions, which I think takes place in a discrete way. Yeah. So, like apparently unrelated organisms might exhibit certain features that correspond to the motion of that center. So there would be a hidden kind of connection between them, which might not be apparent in time, but yeah, that's sort of what I suspect.
I mean, it'd be hard to do worse than the current kind of conception of taxonomy in the tree of life. I think that would be pretty good.
But I can see what you were saying earlier, though, about how that center was related to perception, or the emergence of qualia, beginning roughly with the animal kingdom, as opposed to the plant kingdom. But was that where you were trying to go with that?
Yeah, it is. But you know what? I'm going to say it this way, although I'm always open to revising, but I refuse to believe that the plants and the environments and maybe even the elements don't also perceive in their own way, right? And what's really interesting, or at least entertaining to me, is trying to develop that mode, right? And it's interesting. It just relates back to, okay, well, the plant itself is the resonant embodiment of the cycles of the environment and its affordances, including material. And so it's interesting to get into the seat of a tree and feel the world from that perspective, that nourishing, resonant perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was what I meant by resonance earlier. Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically plants, plants probably have a kind of inner life, but its nature, I think, is quite different from mine. um, I think I sent you some information recently about plant consciousness and some of these, like some of these relationships between the metamorphosis of a plant and the structure of a nervous system or a brain. So yeah, like I tend to regard plants as a kind of temporally distributed brain as opposed to a spatially concentrated brain. So what takes place in the growth of a plant is something like a nervous system, but it never incarnates as an object. But that doesn't mean that it isn't present. you know,
Yeah.
you don't need a brain for perception.
Yeah, it literally develops into, I'll use the word reaches, but it reaches into the veins of sunlight. You know, it reaches into the veins of water and nutrients. Um, just as our nervous system reaches into our distal limbs and their sensations, right, in the material world. And there's non-material considerations too, but you know, it's just the easiest one.
Right. Yeah. Now, yeah, with the introduction of the center, I think begins this kind of limitation, as I mentioned. So I mentioned that qualia arise through limitation or through suppression. So the suppression of real action, um, which is what I think plants essentially lack. So plants essentially lack the capacity to inhibit certain influences, right, in ways that become possible through the circumference and center of an animal body, which I think is, yeah, the genesis of qualia. What we usually mean by perception. Yeah. Because it functions like a mirror. So the circumference of the body is reflecting influences in the external world in a way that gives rise to certain sensations. So plants just lack that mirror.
If what I was saying earlier is, I don't want to use the word true because that's not what I mean. If what I was saying earlier, in the sense that there is nothing which is not the plant, then what you have said here is not precisely false. It might have local precedence and yet not be primordial. Can you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, precisely. Yeah. But
Okay.
yeah. So I would interpret what you said there in terms of the idea that the wholeness of the plant reflects something about the entire cosmos. So the form of the plant, precisely because it lacks a definite center or a kind of mirror that arises in the animal kingdom, embodies as a kind of sigil or like an object something about the totality of space. That's how I tend to think of it. So I tend to see plants as like physical instruments. You can actually perceive something about the interaction between light and gravity within plants. So yeah, so I don't necessarily see a conflict. Maybe you can clarify that.
It's not a conflict. Sorry about the background noise for a second. It's not necessarily a conflict. It's just that what was my motivation in making that statement? locality matters. And at different registers of form and being, there are unique features of participation and intimacy and relation and sensing and development. Yes, yes, all that's true. But it's very easy to lose sight of the unity, which I feel has actual precedence. In fact, I would argue that were we entirely disconnected from it, it's impossible. We would not be having conversations or have minds. Right? Upscale from our desire to speak or question or participate together is in fact this unity. Right. So I just ask that we try to remember, right? Like without that unity, our desire to understand would disappear. And also, very importantly, if unity were to truly pervade over our awareness in a way that was explicit, intelligibility disappears.
Yep.
Intelligibility is the making of parts, and the comparison, and the metaphorization, and the analogies, and the connotations, and all of these things. And I don't want people to get the idea that I'm anti-left hemispheric, quote unquote, silly simplification, because the hemispheres always work together, except in people that don't, are missing one or something, or have them physically divided. Not just people, flies have hemispheric polarization. But trying to say here. What I'm concerned about is the propensity for humans to be captured by the tip of the pinky and pursue its of dominance over all phenomena at any cost, at all costs. That's what concerns me. Intelligibility should not rule, it should serve. And what it should serve is the communal concerns of unity, the recognition that there's just one child in every being and form we see as its face. And that's our face, and it's the face of origin, it's the face of our ancestors and our progeny. We should bear this in mind really before speaking, but certainly before action. There was something else that was bugging me. What was that? The humans with their cognition, their representational consciousness, they are doing something important in time-space. Misguided golem. But they can become a misguided golem. And they do en masse on our world at our time, in our time. That deeply concerns me. So
Yeah,
I'm
sorry,
clear
that
that the representational cognition,
for whatever reason. Could you repeat that? I think I heard something about a golem, but I didn't hear the rest.
Yeah. So can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah, it's somehow a little better, although it's showing me that your connection may not be fantastic. But yeah, I can hear you now.
Let me try to improve that. How's this?
Yeah, good so far.
Okay. So,
yeah, thank you.
All right. Let me rephrase what I said before. I'm a lover of intellect, and I lean heavily into it because I'm good at it. Much like another guy I know in this conversation. And I don't want to give the appearance that I'm anti-intelligence or even that I'm anti-representational cognition. The humans are not merely a misguided golem going mad into techne at the cost of everything important, though they can certainly become that way, and they are that way as a group in our time. They're doing something important to time space, important to existence, important to being. When they do this cognizing thing, they're doing a thing that's similar to what the fungi do, right? They're breaking down and reforging. They're doing this thing. They're doing a symbiotic thing in a layer of existence that we're unaware of. So it's really important that we're representational cognitives. It's not just a bad thing. The problem is how we've been captured as a species. And that I'm very, very concerned about as a human and as a being and as an organism and as a participant in this environment here. Localization is important. It matters. I was in a conversation the other day and they were like, yeah, you know, everything dies. Don't worry about it. I'm like, yeah, fuck that. I love this world. I believe in her. I am her child. I will protect her to the, you know, extent of my abilities. Right? The idea that life's resilient, don't matter if the humans kill everything up, it'll grow back. No. Would I say the same thing about my son or my own hand? No, I wouldn't. I have skin in the game. And even as a bodhisattva or something like this, I still have skin in the game. So these are just some things I wanted to make clear because just like before, right, there was an overriding critical consciousness in me that thought, you know, people could take you wrong. They could think you hated intellect and intelligence and the left hemisphere and all of these things. I just wanted to be clear, no, that's not the case. What I'm opposed to and what deeply concerns me is the capture of that into mechanization, which I don't see as the same thing as nature. Mechanization looks to me like a terrifying symptom of a problem in the relational awareness and cognition in my species. It's not that we should never make devices, objects, or machines, but we should have a pervasive, corrective intelligence that is intimately involved in the decision-making around how this gets done, when it gets done, and what the limits and like boundaries are. So yeah, that's just me making a long, complex, critical apology to my own thought.
Well, I love that, and it's brilliant. I think that this manifestation of these humans, this manifestation of our intellect is an insult to our potential.
Yes, that's so beautifully said.
Well,
yeah, this is us taking a crap in the hand of our intelligence. And then, then going to shake hands with all other beings.
Yeah, it's terrible. It prides itself in its myopia, and what we're capable of with our intellect, but even more so our whole mind, is, well, it's many factors beyond this. But I kind of wonder if this gets back to that other half question. I remember from the conversation that you posted online between you and George, I think this just may be a good entree, is, environments themselves kind of calve and create their animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
something similar is happening in the mind of the universe. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And, and again, this becomes more horizontal, more narrow, and, it's not political, but, it's kind of more with
it's
regard.
Also political.
Yeah. Everything, anyway,
yeah.
I won't quote political phrases for politics, but, the interesting thing is, so the creatures that we see, the animals and also the plants, they are much more, or as much at least, of a reflection of their environments as anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that kind of the the deep interrelational way that everything is only a reflection of everything else because of the forces and the factors and the, the nature
No, it's
of.
because there's no other thing.
Yep.
Right? It's not a reflection. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's, for me to understand me alone is to cut off at least half of my being,
Right.
which is all the rest of it, right? So then, I think maybe this has kind of come up in terms of the beast in the past. So where my mind went when I heard you guys discussing this aspect is not only that environments calve their animals, right? But the animals themselves are the reflection of their origin, their where they came from. And what's really interesting is that we do have this distal history that us humans, especially when we are in a better state, I think a lot of the time these calls go to what are we going to do, without actually acknowledging that we are the expression of the function of our environment, right? So we're the tail on the dog. We're not the head. So what's really, the nature of that question to me is that there was a time when the healthy and integrated environment created the healthy and integrated human, where the environment calved animals that were strong and natural and whatever, and those human animals, of course, then returned the service to the environment, creating a stronger, there's an ecological niche, a way it all interplays and all this. So where this went for me is that it's notable that the environment that has calved these humans is the 10,000, 100,000-year-old dead sunlight. And the technes and the machines, right? And so, what's going on there?
Okay, can I say something
Yeah.
about that briefly?
Yeah, of course. Please.
So imagine that you're a living planet, okay? And you have a problem. You have a really weird problem. And your weird problem is, well, I'm going to even go a little weirder here and say, like, you're an ovum in the womb of a star. So occasionally you get fertilized, right? The sun and the other planets and the local situation select suitors for you. They penetrate you, and organisms come out of that. This is just an as-if story. However, this story we think of as Cinderella, I know that chick. She used to just be an Ash girl, and then, she got a blue dress and shit. And she's got like a sister with a bright red dress, a sister with a rainbow dress with a great big belt buckle, and another sister with golden rings. And a prince comes. There's going to be a ball. Right? And she wants to, she wants a nice dress, but she's just covered in ashes. She's a chimney sweep, slave girl. Yeah, this reminds me of somebody I know. In any case, so you're a girl like this, and you get your blue dress, you meet the prince, and he brings what? Amino acids in ice? A crystal slipper? What, are you kidding me? Crystal slipper? Really? Yeah, crystal slipper. And he slips into your environment so that he doesn't wipe out the organisms that you've already established. Right? He comes in at an angle, obliquely, rather than directly, so it doesn't produce an explosion. But you got a problem, and your problem is that every once in a while, something comes in directly. And that thing basically causes you to have a stroke, because it wipes out the established diversity, which is, in fact, what you think, see, and feel with, at least in the organismal register. So you keep having these strokes, right? It's a lot like being raped. You get violated by these large stony objects from the sky. They're not there to fertilize you. They're going to wipe out the entire history of what you managed to establish and sustain over the previous aeon. So you got a problem. And you notice that one of the creatures that has arisen has the capacity to throw stones, right? To project objects into space-time. And so in this fairy tale, you endow them with the capacity for techne in order to protect yourself and your future children from these penetration events. If they get really fascinated with projectiles and guns and missiles and things, they can deflect those bad suitors and you won't have to have strokes anymore. And with the same irony of fairy tales, you later discover that they're killing each other and everything with the skill you were hoping they would use intelligently to protect you, obviously because they are your children and they would recognize you, but they forgot about all that because the guns are really fascinating. So there's a cautionary tale, there's a myth, there's an image of a possible situation that I find compelling and that Toymaker, showed me as an as-if story. Although the Cinderella thing, that shit's ridiculous. That's a story from before there were humans. That's not a human story. That's our planet story. That's a children's version of the planet story. So yeah, this is a useful toy. I'm not claiming it's the case, but a living world would become concerned about stuff that snuffed her biodiversity over time. I think, presuming that she has such concerns. And she might take one of her children and adapt them to interfere with that. And that could go wildly wrong in the same way that Greek myths often do. Right? You try to avoid something, it's the Oedipus problem, right? You're going to kill your dad, marry your mom. Okay, well, I'm just going to leave my whole country so that won't happen. And then, do everything you can. When you become hyper-focused on avoiding something, what happens? Well, there's a problem there. It's that hyper-focus thing tends to generate what it's trying to avoid. Welcome to my life.
Yeah, I'm reminded of light fixation of the drunk, Yeah, it's a brilliant analogy you put forward. It
was given to me. It was given. That was given. That's not mine. Although I did the translation, I get the credit for that.
Yeah, I think I've told George before, maybe it was on one of these calls to everybody, but taking ownership over thoughts is the most pompous thing I think.
We should be careful. Yeah, that's true, but that's not the only truth. We're so Bayo. I can't remember his proper pronunciation of his last name, but I just want to read something into the meeting here about that briefly, unless you have a pressing thing to share.
No, do go ahead.
So Bayo Akomolafe, I've never tried to pronounce it before. He's a very wise person who writes sometimes on Facebook, and I'm going to just read what he wrote that I saw today. I have often read letters from people, polite folks, who felt that my time was so precious that their persistence in writing me betrayed their inherent selfishness, as if being selfish disqualified them from reaching out or from participating in a complicated world. Most of us seem to have learned to carry that civilizational burden as capably as my textual friends have. These days, as with aeons before, it would seem, the self is the obstacle to get rid of, the pernicious thing, the dark ingredient, the poison. Everyone hopes to move from that diseased prefix ego to the more innocent eco. It would explain the ongoing romanticization of the communal and the proliferation and idealization of communities. I confess that I too have probably contributed to a countercultural milieu that curses at the Anthropocene and its characteristic anthropocentrality, one that is not very practiced at moving through the nuances of such a critique. But to my meandering point, I cannot reject selfishness. I used to do that, trained in my teenage years by revivalist American frontier theologies from the 19th century. I learned to equate selfishness with sin, hamartia, the Greek word in the Bible that means missing the mark. I imagined selfishness to be the opposite of love. The ego had to go if God had to be got. But I cannot reject the ego either, and all attempts to reduce it to some patho-ontology seem only to reinstate its performed centrality. Perhaps then, what we name as selfishness is an acommunal tension within the communal that distresses its claims to wholeness, completion, and fullness. Perhaps the ego is how the eco researches itself. Perhaps separation is how entanglement comes to understand itself. Perhaps there are tensions within fidelity. Perhaps there are weird minor gestures in purity. Perhaps the ants need the zombie ant to selfishly chart its cordyceps fungal cartography away from the community. Perhaps the post-humanist needs the humanist to think well about the world. The problem here doesn't seem to be with selfishness or the ego, but with where it is located. The Procrustean surgical operation that transplants an entire biopolitical, agonistic, zoetic field of multi-species matterings into the isolated individuality of the citizen subject compels us to perform our lives as if we were behind the wheels, as if we were the ones living our lives, as if our lives are not already threaded through with other lives and deaths. But we are not selves any more than the wave is the entire ocean. Self cannot be held by an individual. Self is not human, not exclusively so. The self is a mangled, sweltering, rampaging, murmuring, whispering trace of tensions in their entrainments and becoming with the world. Selfishness is not disqualifying. Selfishness is not sin. Or instead, it is only sin in the sense that everything else is, because everything misses the mark. And that, my friends, textual and otherwise, is a beautiful thing indeed.
It's a beautiful thing indeed.
We agree about that. Sing it, brother. Remind us, which brings me to a point I will share before perhaps departing. I've come to understand that minds are not for thinking. They are for doing something similar to what we do here today, I think, together for each other and for all beings. So actually there are 2 points. The first is that the humans are not inclined to think that the waves that inform the structure of the plant arrive from the future as well as the past, but I do. I know for myself that time is all of time, is a body, and that every moment there is more future and more past. There is an end, there is a boundary, but it's not the end of time. It's simply the current extent of the dandelion's pulse. So yeah, waves arrive from the future and inform what we do and think and are, and we don't think this way. But the other thing I was going to say is that it occurred to me that one of the things we do is we become amanoetic together. We serve to keep alive memory and intelligence and the beauty of rediscovering and unforgetting together. And so in a sense, we are each other's memories, speaking as though separate and distinct in bodies and time. And without selves, this would not work. So, you know, I try to get out of my own way too, and I try to take the Darren off the presentation. And that's often useful, but it's not a thing that should be made explicit, which is, I think, what Bayo was trying to remind us about. We think it's a good idea to dissolve the ego. Unfortunately, it's an incomplete virtue at best. We are each other's memories. We remind one another of virtue and insight and recognition and reunion and communion. And I love that we can do this together. So I'm very grateful for this time today. I'm going to take my leave here and look forward with great enthusiasm to posting this on my channel. I'll be very selfish about that. I want that recording as soon as it's available.
It sounds good.
I'm gonna put my name on it and everything. Yeah.
You want it, and by getting it, you cast it out to all the ears of the world.
But
Ironically.
I unfortunately fulfill the desire that I'd be better off having sustained. Thank you guys. I love you. You're amazing. I'll see you again very soon, I hope.
All right, Darren. Take care. See you soon.
Thank you.
Peace for now.